Tranquility du Jour, April 15th, 2019. Bask in a day-long masterclass for living life with more tranquility, creativity, and style while noshing at a world-renowned plant-based restaurant. Mingle with other members of the TDJ community and dream big. Join us for TDJ Soirée, June 9th in Washington, D.C. Limited spots remain. Learn more at KimberlyWilson.com/soiree. Hello there, this is Kimberly Wilson, and welcome to the 451st edition of Tranquility du Jour. Today, I'm chatting with Latoya Peterson about racial justice, diversity, inclusion, and so much more. I think you're going to love this. At one point during or at the end of the interview, I was like, oh, Latoya, we have to end, because both of us had to get to I think I had a client and she had a yoga class. But I was like, I could have gone on for hours. So I'm sure we'll have Latoya back on the show, but I think you're going to love this podcast. Now, new listeners, a big welcome, and there is a link in the show notes that tells you a bit more about Tranquility du Jour. You can find that at KimberlyWilson.com/451. And then also sign up for my ongoing newsletter, which is Love Notes, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of all sorts of ways to find more tranquility in the everyday, from MP3s, PDFs, videos, etc. Also, a big thank you to those of you who tuned in and gave feedback on last week's episode 450, our 450th edition of Tranquility du Jour. And in that episode, as many of you know, I tried to do a little recap on what has transpired since the 400th episode, which was kind of like the last big milestone one that we did, and answered some of your questions and kind of let you know what was going on project-wise for me. So if you have a moment to drop a note and let me know what you thought of the podcast, I would so appreciate it. I love hearing from you, and it's also nice to know how things land and what questions you have or suggestions, etc. So please don't hesitate to reach out. hello@KimberlyWilson.com. Also, if you have a moment to pin a review of this podcast on iTunes, my hope is that it helps other people find more tranquility in their every day. And there's a link to do so in the show notes. So, of course, just head on over to iTunes, click podcasts, type in Tranquility du Jour, and voila, there you are. Now, a few things about some upcoming events. We have Pigs, Pugs, and Pinot happening in less than 2 weeks, and that is going to have Charlotte the Potbelly Pig, a bunch of pugs, and other dogs at a wine bar here in Washington, D.C., and it's a fundraiser for Pigs and Pugs Project. And our mission is to make the lives of pigs and pugs happier. And also, June 8th at Burleigh Manor Animal Sanctuary, our 4th annual Yoga and the Animals. It's a 4-hour event, including a private tour, a yoga practice, and a vegan lunch. Now, those of you who are in the area or willing to fly in from LA, as we have someone doing, or come down from New York, as we have someone doing, or, from anywhere in the DC area or anywhere in between, would love to have you for the TDJ Soirée, my first day-long event in quite a while, and that is happening on June 9th here in Washington, D.C. at Elizabeth's, named number 6 vegan-friendly restaurant in the world. TDJ Live is happening on June 23rd. It's a free online seasonal event. If you'd like to escape to Tuscany and do some yoga, creativity, and mindfulness, there are 4 spots left for that retreat. That's happening July 13th through the 20th. And those of you up in Canada, I'm going to be returning to Montreal September 21st and 22nd and helping with Luna Yoga's advanced teacher training, talking about creativity, mindfulness, and the business of yoga. So come on out for that. Those of you who are up in that neck of the woods would love to see you again. All right. So Latoya, a certified media junkie. She provides a hip-hop feminist and anti-racist view on pop culture with a special focus on video games, film, television, and music. One of Forbes magazine's 30 under 30 rising stars in media for 2013, she's best known for the award-winning blog Racialicious.com, the intersection of race and pop culture. She's currently the deputy editor, Digital Innovation for ESPN's The Undefeated. Previously, she was an editor-at-large at Fusion, the senior digital producer for The Stream, a social media-driven news show on Al Jazeera America, and a John S. Knight Journalism 2012 to 2013 fellow at Stanford University, focusing on mobile technology and digital access. She produced a YouTube series on girl gamers and is currently working on virtual and augmented reality projects. Her work has been published in ESPN Magazine, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Essence, Spin, Vibe, Marie Claire, American Prospect, The Guardian, and many other outlets. She was a contributor to Jezebel.com. Her essay, The Not Rape Epidemic, was published in the anthology Yes Means Yes, Visions of Female Sexual Power and a World Without Rape. She also contributed The Feminist Existential Crisis to the anthology Feminism for Real, Deconstructing the Academic Industrial Complex of Feminism. As a digital media consultant, Latoya has worked with brands like NPR, Wikipedia, and Weber Shandwick to provide demographic analysis, ideas on improving user experience, and specialized outreach. She was also a guest host for WEAA's Michael Eric Dyson Show and a contributor substitute digital producer for Al Jazeera's International's version of The Stream. She was also a Harvard Berkman Center affiliate, a Poynter Institute Sensemaking Fellow, and one of the inaugural Public Media Corps Fellow. So basically, she's a rock star. Welcome, Latoya.
Hey, Kimberly, how are you?
I am good, and I am delighted to have you on the show.
Same. I loved hearing Jamia's episode, so it's fun to have my turn.
Oh, Jamia. Yeah, she was wonderful to have on the show, and she was so much fun to have in Paris.
Oh, yeah, she's amazing.
So this topic, I feel like, is so overdue. Like, I should have had you on the show 10 years ago. And race. Let's talk race, right? So this can be a pretty tough topic. And so I'm wondering, as like, I don't know, I feel like you kind of are an expert in all this, having run this like amazing blog that I just heard that Gloria Steinem used to read, Racialicious. And what was so funny is having you at the New Year salon when there's a girl next to you who came in from New York and is like, oh my God, you wrote Racialicious? I used to read that. Like, what a small world, right?
It is. It's always fun when I meet Racialicious readers out in the world, right? Because so the blog ran from, well, technically it started as Mixed Media Watch, and that was Carmen Van Kerkhove and Jen Chow, who ran a blog about being mixed. And before, they had come from some forum called Eurasian Nation. So this was like a blog on Zanga. So this is how long ago this was. 04 and 05 called Mixed Media Watch, which was all about representations of mixed people in media. And they had started expanding out and trying to really discuss more. And then I had found their podcast, Addicted to Race. One time I was traveling for work and I was feeling very alienated. Listened to that, wrote in, started becoming a contributor. Eventually I ended up becoming very close with Carmen, became the editor of the blog back in like 2008 when they transitioned over to Racialicious. Became the editor-in-chief, so that's why sometimes people are confused. They think I'm the founder, and I'm not. Actually, it was Carmen and Jen. But the voice changed a lot when it became Racialicious, and it was a lot of my editorial voice as well. And then we ran until about 2015 when we got hacked the second time and stopped. So yeah, I mean, it's been a decade in the racial justice space. Before that, I was on forums and boards, but not like doing anything organized. And, 10 years of facilitating cross-national global conversations about race and how it operates in different places. So it was as much of an education as I was trying to facilitate conversations and bring people in. We had a wonderful team. I think at our peak we had and this is back in 2008, 2012 numbers, where we had 250,000 readers a month, which for a boring race blog was pretty cool.
It's amazing.
And we also had 7 or 8 regular contributors and then 100 or so kind of guest contributors and then our commenters who were awesome. So we had really, really amazing conversations that we were able to host and be proxy to.
Well, and and that's just amazing because I think back to that time. You and your boyfriend at the time, he wasn't your husband, were like coming to Tranquility Trunk shows. You were coming to Tranquil Space yoga classes. You were a volunteer for Tranquil Space Foundation. And, you had all this stuff going on. Oh, and you came to Paris and Provence in 2012. So it's like you were doing all this amazing stuff. And I don't feel like I was really privy to it.
Yeah, well, racial justice is not something you kind of bring up all the time in casual conversation. It's kind of like there was a point of decompression. So when I started at TS, I was seeking refuge from a very stressful job. I was working in the federal government and I was totally stressed out. I feel like this is similar to your story where you were like a paralegal.
Right.
You were like, I can find something else. Right. Yoga. Right. And I was like, I am a federal contracting officer and this job blows. Like I need something else. And my friend had introduced me to Tranquil Space and specifically the inclusive nature of it with voluptuous vinyasa that Gina used to teach. So that was the first class I ever went to because I'm plus sized. And it was hard finding a yoga space that I felt like could fit or that could accommodate. And it's very intimidating to walk into a new space like that and to kind of try to get healing, but to be so different and to be so kind of out of place in some ways. So it was cool to find Gina's class. I think that ended about a year after I started going. But by then I was already kind of like all into the studio and very into what would eventually be a regular yoga practice. But, lots of interesting things to explore on those axes.
Yeah. And you're right. It's not like racial justice does just come up in everyday conversation. Now I feel like it is a very popular topic, really, since 2016. I mean, not that it wasn't before, but I think once our, dear friend Trump took office, that really like things have shifted. I feel like people are so much more aware. Do you feel that way? Or is it just me kind of as an outsider looking in of being like, wow, I'm exposed to so much more than I used to be, or my eyes are opened?
I think that these things come in cycles. Like if you study the history of civil rights and you study all these things, there's periods of when people feel like things are progressing racially and they don't have to do much or that we've made a lot of progress. So remember, like when Obama was elected, right? There was all kinds of craziness happening behind the scenes, all kinds of coded racism, dog whistles, like all of this madness. But almost everyone in America, outside of like the diehard, I still will hate, I'm going to be a racist forever. I was like, we can all look, even Fox News was like, look, we can all look at this occasion and be proud as Americans. Like everyone's like, oh, look, we can do this. And so I think for a lot of us too, in like the race blogging, like the racial justice blogosphere, which there was one, was closely related to the feminist blogosphere and the overall social justice blogosphere. But all of us are kind of like, whoa, like we've made this incredible progress. And yes, there's still problems and there's all these things that we still need to solve, but things feel like they're working toward a better solution. And then, fast forward, right? 4 more years, and then another term, right? And then we get to Trump, who is campaigning on racially divisive language and rhetoric. You have people who voted for Obama turning around and voting for Trump, which again, like really muddies the narrative. A lot of times when people want to talk about race, they want to make it very simple and to make it seem like, oh, it's these racists over here and then these like good people over here. And that's almost never what's happening, right? Almost everything is a much more complicated dynamic. And then when you start understanding like racism as a system, it becomes a much different kind of conversation when it's not just interpersonal, like, oh, this person's being mean or this person said something horrible or this person did something horrible that, by those standards might not have been as bad, but by these standards seem awful. When you really start looking at how we have conversations about race and how we're taught to think about race and what it actually takes to have the types of systems that allow for a bunch of white supremacists to come to the Capitol with tiki torches, right? Like these things are things that grow over time and they grow and they fester and people don't check them. And it starts a lot of times with something small. So when Trump first started, everybody's going, well, it's the birther guy, it's this, it's that. But he can't be that bad. And then as you see time and time again, you're starting to see so many more things where I think, particularly folks who weren't super involved and they were just like, oh, I'm just living my life. I don't feel like I'm very racist. I might not have a racist person in my family, or I might know some people, but that's not most people I know. And then for them to see how quickly some of these things that we thought were in the deep past suddenly resurfaced, I think for a lot of people was a wake-up call and was a reality check. My friend Erie tells a great story about her dad. So Erie's dad is Jewish, And she was like, as for her whole youth, he was always like, well, what are you going to do, Erie, when the Nazis come back? And Erie goes, Dad, that's morbid. Like, why are you bringing this up all the time? Like, we're just going out for ice cream. Like, why do you keep bringing this up? And lo and behold, she was like, and here we are. It's 2018 and we're fighting Nazis. Like, how did this happen? But again, these things are never just kind of out of the blue or out of it's these things build over time. And if we're not being really vigilant about, racial attitudes, the ways that people talk about other people, then you fall back into those same patterns that give rise to these systems again.
Well, and what you're talking about too, you keep using the phrase racial justice, which I think all of us get. But could you define, whenever you say racial justice, what is your definition of that?
Yeah. So racial justice is really a movement in which we want all people to be seen as equal, but not just in like the kind of candy, of course, I believe in equality for all people, kind of that very pat response you normally get. But when we're talking about equal under the eyes of the law, equal in terms of opportunities in society, we're talking about a full system of equality that, for many folks who are of what we would call minority identities or particularly non-white identities in the United States, these things just are not true. And it's from an economic standpoint where you have down to, I think Condoleezza Rice was talking about how your zip code in the United States will determine your overall income and educational attainment. And we're seeing that in very interesting spaces too, even Facebook and them through ad targeting. They can figure out your race by proxy if they look at your zip code and a couple other identifiers. It's not. So the fact that these things are such a strong determinant, the fact that you're seeing, medical outcomes, things that most people don't think about, because most people keep race as an interpersonal thing, like, oh, someone's being mean to somebody else. And then there's health outcomes that are associated with racism, where African Americans die more quickly for reasons that people don't fully understand, and they think it's the weight of racism. There are all these medical studies about how African Americans aren't prescribed the same level of pain medication when they go in for ailments. It's the same as, a white person walking in. If two people go to the emergency room and one is black and one is white, the black one is more likely to be prescribed less pain medication for the same symptoms. And it's like, there's all of these things that happen. There's financial system issues. There's conversations about essentially how the outcomes of African-American boys from 1% income classes having essentially the same life outcomes as white men from, lower income classes. It's a really strange dynamic that keeps popping up time and time again because it's a much more broad and complex system. So when we talk about racial justice, what we're really talking about is dismantling systems that keep people oppressed or keep people at a disadvantage compared to others.
So interesting, and it's so helpful to hear this because I think that, of course we see the news, we see everything that's going on. And yet to really hear oh my gosh, this is happening and this is happening. Because I think so many of us do relate to this idea of being a feminist, right? And then that means believing in equality for all. And as you said, that's not just lip service, right? We have to really dive into it. And it's very layered. So my question for you is, how do you feel that women, white women in particular, can be better allies for people of color?
I think one of the biggest things is listening. And actively listening and being really, really intentional about that listening. Because what we find a lot of times, particularly for feminists of color, I don't know if Jamia spoke to it on the podcast, but she's been very vocal about this as well. And many other folks, when we go into feminist spaces, there's always that, but some of us are brave issue where it's all the women are white, all the blacks are men. But some of us are brave, which is a great collection if you have not read it. These are required readings. It's one of those things where feminism is supposed to be about women, right? And women's rights and understanding, again, and fighting for equality for all women. And what you'll start noticing is that women are impacted differently by different types of things. So if you're coming from your perspective, which, most people do, you feel your own pain most keenly. And so most people go, okay, well, this is happening to me and I want to change it and I want to fix it. But what we start seeing happening, particularly in feminist movements, which really has been a crack and a fissure since womanism, right? Since Alice Walker, since before that, I'm sure. There's been this crack where it's like, hey, white women, we're trying to tell you about our problems and our pain, and you are not listening. You are not paying attention because you feel like it doesn't really relate to you and you don't want to think about what this actually means. And so what that does then is it makes it feel as though there are women's issues, with capital W, and then there's all of these other kind of inconvenient lowercase women's issues that impact women of color, that impact disproportionately, that are not as interesting. So like a big part of this is, some of the backlash to like things like Lean In, right? Which is Sheryl Sandberg's work now, I should mention that Sheryl has actually been a good friend to me, and I went to her in Silicon Valley dinner. She's been a good mentor. So I'm not exactly neutral on the topic of Sheryl Sandberg. But Sheryl's book got really criticized with Lean In. And one of the first conversations we had talking about whether or not Black women were even at the table in this conversation, in this discussion, because we are perceived so differently. So what a white woman might experience trying to climb the office hierarchy and feeling shut out by the glass ceiling, it's a kind of different battle for many women of color who have already been kind of overcoming all of the racial stereotypes. And we have to overcome all the gender stereotypes. Then there are specific kind of gender and race stereotypes that are just us. Black women are too loud. We're too aggressive. And these things are seen a certain way in a corporate environment that aren't going to be ascribed to white women, right? So the whole do I want to cry at work? Do I look like a bad employee? That definitely applies to some people in the population. It's not specifically race-based, but Black women in particular might be targeted for other types of things. And if those things aren't discussed and unearthed, if we're not talking about the pay gap, and I think Lean In Foundation this year did a big thing on just illuminating even the pay gap, right? Where it's like if white women are making, what is it like currently, 79 cents to a man's dollar? Is that where we are?
Yeah, I think so.
It's about every year. But it's 79 cents to a man's dollar. And I think for Black women, it got down to 59 cents. And Latinas, it's 51 cents. I'll have to double check on Lean In because it's been a few months since the campaign. But these are huge wage gaps. And you're seeing even, I think they just published a study talking about African Americans with MBAs and how there's still a pay gap even there. So an MBA was considered kind of like the way you equalize in corporate America, where it's like, okay, well, if you're an African American, you will probably get paid less. However, if you go get this master's in business administration, people will take you more seriously and you'll get, the same pay as your white peers. And what they started to find in this more recent study is that that's actually not true. There's still a pay gap. So, but when we look at these topics, and I think under an umbrella of something like feminism, we're trying to advance a goal. One of the criticisms that you tend to hear from white women who don't want to listen and don't want to listen intentionally is, oh, well, you're really kind of diluting the issue. I don't really feel like this is a feminist issue. I don't really feel like this is relevant to our interest. Or you see things that are promoting kind of an agenda that might make sense to one population, but could be really disastrous and ruinous to another population, right? So you get a lot of charges of corporate feminism or white women's feminism. And so there's a lot that comes with unpacking when you want to be in solidarity with someone else, or when you want to try to advance an agenda that you think is going to work for a lot of people. Really being intentional and trying to figure out what's the best way forward for kind of the most participants, and not just kind of what maybe has animated you to come to this space. But that's been an ongoing issue.
Well, yeah, it's funny because whenever I saw the Gloria Steinem play recently, she as the actress, even mentioned how it's like, I was kind of called out as a leader or what have you. And yet I was up there with people like Flo Kennedy or, others. And yet they weren't getting the same level of attention that I was. And so she would try to kind of make sure that their names were heard just as much, or, kind of promoted or what have you. And so one of the things before we started recording, you actually mentioned Flo Kennedy. And so do you have a favorite? And I know this isn't being, this is hard because I'm sure there's many, but favorite kind of African-American feminists from that era, from the second wave, who really kind of speaks to you or that you kind of love reading about?
My God. I mean, we have a lot of foremothers, right? When you start studying these types of histories, then you start unveiling all kinds of people. The second wave is a really interesting term. All right. I was in one of my friend's books, Jessica Yee Danforth, and she wrote this book called Feminism for Real. And it's from an indigenous perspective. And one of my favorite essays in it is called, excuse the language, but it's called Fuck Your Waves, We Are the Ocean. And it was about looking at things from an indigenous perspective, where matriarchal understandings and feminism have been part of the landscape since the beginning. And so this idea of waves is really kind of like a North American, Eurocentric way of looking at this is how we divide a movement. women up, which I don't know if they would necessarily think of themselves in that way. So even like of the second wave, like Flo Kennedy, yeah, and she's got a lot of interesting ass stories. I mean, like one of my favorites, and I'll come back to it a little later, was writing for Jezebel about the Newsweek lawsuit and seeing how the story was framed completely around like a white perspective when the lead litigator was Flo Kennedy. And none of the Black women at Newsweek at the time had joined that historic lawsuit against sex discrimination, even though they were employed there. And I was like, yo, like, where is the footnote? There's no conversation why Black women didn't like come and join this gender lawsuit that was litigated ultimately by Flo Kennedy. Like, whoa. But the writers and the people who constructed that piece didn't even see it as noteworthy. It was not part of their conversation. So you read about it on Jezebel, started a whole fight, like the usual thing. The reason I told that earlier story, though, was because the framing of second wave, there were a lot of the women who we would consider foremothers were actually trying to separate themselves. And so like Alice Walker had started womanism and said her very famous quote, which is like, womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender. They really felt like feminism was not speaking to them. There were people like Audre Lorde, who's, you know, just fantastic, just an amazing thinker and writer and visionary. Patricia Hill Collins, who wrote Black Feminist Thought. So a lot of these folks were essentially like renegades of the second wave. And then, of course, you have our foremothers who aren't African-American, but people who wrote these things like This Bridge Called My Back, who are starting to really pull together different types of women's experiences and saying, okay, like this does not reflect us. So the second wave feminism that was popularized still left out a lot of women's experiences and then their foundational works of trying to define themselves against this thing that they didn't see reflecting them became the foundation for essentially what some people would call the third wave, which again, that's still controversial, and also became the foundation for a lot of the kind of modern social justice thought. Most importantly, I think Kimberly Crenshaw, and I got to remember her exact years because she's coming in at the end. So it'd probably be late, which you would call second wave, early, which you call third wave. But her whole concept of interlocking oppressions and really kind of having this idea of intersectionality, which again, people take for granted now, but this was a new concept in the 80s that we're not going to separate out the types of oppressions that are happening to someone.
Wow. Yeah. There's so many layers, right? You know, and I'm curious, Latoya, how did you become so kind of knowledgeable about all this? Did you study this? Like I'm thinking in college, right? That was my first exposure to women's studies and, you know, of course, African-American feminism and, you know, the whole kind of piece. And so that was like my last year in college. And so I'm just curious for you, like, has this always been a topic of, you know, deep interest, really, you know, particularly the history and all the different layers associated? Or is this simply coming out of like, you know, your personal experience?
Yeah, a lot of it was literally personal experience in the blog world. And so I actually dropped out of college. When I was in college, I was studying global business and public policy. I did nothing with nothing with social justice. The thing I did like about social justice was section 305.6 in the Dewey Decimal System. That is the sociology section. And so I would just go wander over there if I was in the library. And I think the first feminist thing I ever read was called Manifesta. Mm-hmm. Long time ago. So I found it when I was about 14 years old. I was like, what is this? Right? And, you know, started reading from there and started looking at different types of theorems. But all of this knowledge is, again, over 10 years of trying to host and facilitate conversations with people who were just coming from all different perspectives all over the world. And like, we used to get sent a lot of free books, which is great about blogging. Like my bookshelves, if you ever come to my house, like they're just full of all kinds. Like if I'm looking right now, I'm like, oh, it's the Black Campus Movement from 1969 to 1980, apartheid and imperialism. That's on my shelf right now. Say It Loud, speeches of the Civil Rights Movement, Conversations with Octavia Butler, which is an amazing book that everybody needs to read. And so we got all of these like books sent to us. We were in conversations with teachers and scholars and historians and people who were doing all this work. And I mean, we had started out with the blog. I mean, the blog had started out just on like looking at television. We were very pop culture heavy and looking at television and critiquing some of the really strange things that would happen. I think Carmen and them had a lot of love for America's Next Top Model and the way race is discussed on America's Next Top Model. And then over time, it was like, as we were all studying and bringing in different ideas, you know, someone's like, oh, have you read Spivak? No, I haven't read Spivak, right? Have you ever read, you know, Patricia Hill Collins? Have you guys seen this book or looked at this exhibit or went to this art history thing? And we were getting it from so many places that just over time, you built up this big bank of knowledge of what was happening. But it wasn't something I intentionally sought. It was more when you're trying to find explanations for something that's happened to you or something that keeps happening to you, you're looking for a language, right? In the same way that I think a lot of people come to feminism, right? I don't understand why I feel this way. I don't understand why it's okay. Or like one of Jessica Valenti, one of Jessica's earlier books was like, you know, he's a stud, she's a slut, and other like myths around sexuality, right? And you don't have that language when you first start, right? When you begin this journey, I think if you would just look at the reading list, most people would be afraid and run away. But when you start this journey, you're going, hey, you know what? You're right. Like, why does this keep happening? Why is this consistent? Why do we all have this awareness and yet stuff hasn't changed? And then when you start trying to unravel those leads, I mean, you start going down these very interesting holes that you can only really fill by understanding history, context, movements. And so I think, you know, for a lot of people, it's about letting your curiosity lead you to the place where you want to go and being open to hearing other people's perspectives, because normally they'll cite things that were meaningful to them. Most of what I've honestly learned from my friends. People cite the works that meant the most to them. People cite the pieces that helped them save their life. People cite theory. People cite, you know, critical thinking exercises. People cite classes. And you go back and you look at what people have pulled together and what people are doing. You go, oh, okay, these are the things that made you. And I understand these reference points now. And therefore, they start to kind of inform me. But this is, again, like 10 years of having 3 times daily conversations about all manner of race, gender, and feminism. And then also being in conversation with our friends, right? Our blogger friends at Feministing and Feministe and Sepia Mutiny and Angry Asian Man and Reappropriate and like just all of these other like amazing, fantastic blogs, like, you know, Madame Noir. There's so many places that are gone now too, like Black Looks and things like that. But having these conversations with people and like, you know, some people are coming from the Caribbean diaspora, and how do we talk about, you know, Caribbean feminisms versus African-American women feminisms versus kind of like the broader idea of what feminism is. You need to start to have a shared language and a shared construct for that. And a lot of times for us, we bridge it through pop culture and then kind of put the theory in on the back, right? So we're like, oh, well, this was what happened on Buffy, or we all were very obsessed with Heroes. I remember The Walking Dead. Like we would look at these TV systems, which were an entry point. Because again, you didn't need to know anything besides watch the show. And then kind of use that on the back end to talk about some of this like critical race theory or critical feminist theory and put it in a way that wasn't intimidating or threatening, where you could kind of like digest a little bit of it. And if you want to know more, you keep reading. So that's kind of, I think, yeah, the motto of that is just if you keep reading, you'll get there. It's just a lot of reading.
Well, you know, it's so funny you mentioned Manifesta, because I'm pretty sure in the first year or two of the podcast that I interviewed those ladies. It's 2 authors, right?
Yes, 2 authors.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Manifesta is interesting to me because now I'm like, I remember reading it and loving it and being like, hell yeah. Mm-hmm. Also like the Spice Girls version of feminism where I was like, hell yeah. And then now I'm like, ooh, can I go back here? Maybe I shouldn't go back here. Maybe I should keep my memory intact of how awesome this was and not like, is this exclusionary? Maybe I don't want to know. So, I mean, that happens too. That was a big one too. Like you read things that are foundational to you and then you come back and you're like, yo, this was mad problematic.
Right.
Ways. You know, and it's this process of always like reconciling these things that have influence on you versus what it may be actually putting out into the broader world.
Right.
That's too.
Yeah. Well, you know, what's crazy is I'm pretty sure I remember even asking them, like, because I got a master's in women's studies, right? And I was so confused. Why are we wanting men involved in the feminist movement? Like I could not wrap my head around that. And I remember even asking them, I was like, why are we so, inclusionary? Like why men? Like I don't understand. And I remember them being like, well, because we want everyone to be part of this cause. I'm still embarrassed about that question because of course we do. And I don't know why that wasn't quite resonating, but I remember at that program at GW, I was like, why are we reading all these people? Who are these people? Like, I thought I'd be reading like Sylvia Plath, Anais Nin, like, Audre Lorde, which we did, Bell Hooks. But, it's just like, there were so many, like a range. And I don't know what I was expecting, but clearly my lens was very small. And so I just, when you mentioned Manifesta, I just kind of shrunk a little because I was like, oh yeah, I remember that podcast interview.
I think that's important. I'm really glad you shared that story because like people always assume that you like spring fully formed into your like righteousness. And that is not how this happens, right? I think I wrote a bit a long time ago on Racialicious about being kind of raised like more Black separatist. And not really feeling like there was a place for white people in the racial justice movement, right? And it wasn't until like I started blogging and really engaging people because of the people I'd engaged with before and like early racial justice work on like boards that were at teenagers were a lot of folks who were advocating very racist stances, right? And they came into like proxy for all white people. And you're like, okay, this is an issue. And it wasn't until I really got on racialist, I'm like, wait a minute, there's a lot of people who are very invested in this who are not, not people of color and not impacted. They still have a place and a voice and a space in the movement. And again, not everybody thinks that way. And so you see that a lot of times there's that what we call kind of like the zeal of the converted, right? You see this in religion. You see this everywhere where it's like everything is effed up and we're going to burn the whole thing down. We don't need anybody but ourselves. And you start realizing like the world is a very complex place. Right. But like everybody comes to it in their own time too. So it's again, like, if anybody's sounding like a sage on the mountaintop, that is normally not what's happening. Like they have their own trash too. And I mean, like God, if I just think about the fights we had in the blogosphere, I mean, I remember when, we really started talking about trans inclusivity, what was going on, and the term TERFs started happening, trans exclusionary radical feminists, and how that is still a topic that is going now. I was like, man, this is 2008. Like, how is this still a debate, still a conversation about how we include trans women in these conversations? And there's a lot of, problems like, again, you don't start out fully formed with an immaculate politic. That never, ever seems to happen. And so understanding that people might be learning, growing, bumping against you in uncomfortable ways, hurting you sometimes in uncomfortable ways, and you might be causing the same harm is really important if you're trying to be in solidarity and create a movement. Because you have to understand that a movement is created of people. People are naturally going to be flawed. And to expect the perfection, again, that zeal of the converted, everybody must be perfect and aligned to my practice, as opposed to looking at a more kind of liberation theory, is really important. There was a blogger, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and I remember she used to always talk about love, right? Radical love. And I was like, woman, it is time for the revolution. It is not time for love. What are you talking about? Like, people need to pay. What is going on? And we had lots of debates about that. But over the years, like, again, doing it for 10 years, the first few, you're holding on to your own beliefs and you're trying to figure out where they fit and you're saying like you're doing whatever. And then if you're very serious and you're like, no, I'm really committed to this cause, you start realizing that people keep preaching these things of nonviolence, these things of love, this listening, this practice, these phrases. I think this is a feminist one that was, I don't want to be in a revolution when I can't dance. Right. All those things sound really strange when you first start. And you're like, who are these people? Don't they realize there's serious business afoot? But as you keep going deeper and deeper into movements, the whole point of a movement is to make people's lives better. And you're not really going to make somebody's lives better being like super strident or like trying to fight every single person in every single battle until they say things exactly the way that you want them to be said. It's more about how you allow, all beings essentially to be healthy and free. How do you get to that point? And that normally takes a lot of self-introspection and it takes a lot of self-change. We're all very willing to go out and jump in and change the world. And it's much, much harder to listen back and change the self.
I love that. That's such a good reminder. And I think you're so right with regard to kind of the initial, like how excited you are and how, at the beginning and, so self-righteous about things. You see that within so many movements. And it's like, okay, let's take a step back and realize you did not come out, this informed, and you still have a long way to go to figure it out.
Yes. And then also too, just being aware that other people are on their own journeys too.
Right.
And like, that's the hardest thing, right? Like, especially if you look at like histories of movements, be it civil rights, be it feminism, be it whichever peace movement, anti-war movement, anti-imperialist movements. Movements are always full of flawed leaders, people that hate, lots of arguments. I gave a talk one time at the Harvard Black Law Students Association because they had a social justice convening. And I was speaking with one of the people who had marched with Dr. King. And he was a preacher, and he came through and he was like, look, at the peak of civil rights, only 17% of the country was with us. Like, now everybody remembers it. It was great. And of course, we were all on board with this, desegregation. He was like, that was not the reality. That was not what was happening. But, over time, history will bear you out. Over time, things become more fair, right? Like over time, there are these conversations. When I was talking to Carmen Van Kerkhove, the co-founder of the blog, when I was talking to Carmen the other day, one of the things that she said to me, she was like, do you remember like how different the conversations are now? Like before, when we were writing about things, the New York Times wouldn't even say when like something was racially biased or have racial issues. And it's still happening to this day. Like, don't get me wrong, that like there wasn't a racial utopia point that was hit. But they wouldn't even talk about race as an actual like consideration when they were doing arts reviews or different things. And we used to call a lot of that out and engage a lot with the New York Times writers because they were like, well, what are these blogs talking about? Like, why? And now she was like, I was watching Riverdale. And, this girl, there's a monologue where the girl's like, yeah, you can keep your toxic masculinity. And again, this used to be like feminist theory, like toxic masculinity, what this was. And now it's just in the everyday language and lexicon. It's in everyone's vocabulary. And that is remarkable.
Yes.
From where we started, right? Like, Racialist was 04, 08, and we just started talking about these things. And to have that politic be playing out in just, any casual person's vocabulary, that's huge. But people don't realize it because, progress is so incremental. A lot of times you can't see it when it's happening. You can only see it kind of in retrospect.
Yeah, but it is huge. I mean, I totally agree with you. And it does feel like it's just been in the past few years. But, I think you're right. It did start in the O's. I mean, with all the blogging and what have you that was going on. I mean, I think there was so much consciousness raising and it continues. And it's exciting to see, that toxic masculinity and privilege is something, that people know what that is. People are aware of that.
Yeah. And it's not like, even when you look at, it was awful because again, like one of the things you also start to notice if you've been studying this for a long time is that progress tends to be like more of a boomerang kind of thing or like a grandfather clock, right? You have this swing toward kind of like a new future and then you have the regression period that rolls in after it, right? For the 60s, there is the 80s, right? Like there is always something like kind of going back and forth. And so it was really fascinating to watch the Kavanaugh hearings after Anita Hill. Again, if you remember being in the 90s during that point, I was very young, but I still remember it, where, people were breaking their necks to have excuses of why Anita Hill was totally wrong. And, boys are having boys. Boys are just being boys. He was just having fun at work. What's wrong with her? Why is she so uptight? There were so many things that were just awful about those hearings that we look back on now. We're like, how could anybody have said that with a straight face? And of course, Clarence Thomas was confirmed. So fast forward, right?
Yes.
5 years, you have Anita Hill's story being portrayed, right, on HBO in Confirmation, which is amazing. Right? I mean, it's just an amazing moment. And the same thing basically happened. Like,
right.
The characters were white this time. That was the difference. But the same thing played out. So it's weird because in some ways we've come really far. And most of the behaviors that were described couldn't have happened in a modern workplace in the same way. Though I say that having sat through, my current industry, like Hollywood, like walking on the Me Too thing and like Weinstein thing happening and people going down for that and still seeing those effects reverberate throughout the universe. So we think that these things can't happen anymore. We think that these things are in the past, but are they really? There's more awareness and there's more understanding that this is wrong, but have things really changed? That's always the challenge. Have things really changed? Have we seen something very, very different where again, so Kavanaugh is now in the Supreme Court?
So upsetting, I tell you. And one of the senators, watching this, it was, rage inducing. And I think that, one of the pieces that really struck with me, and I'm not sure which senator it was, I cannot remember, but an older white man. And he was like, this is really horrible that happened to you. And I'm hoping that we will not repeat the same thing, that we learned from the Anita Hill situation or something along those lines. And I was like, oh my God, I love you. Right. And then, to see the way it played out, it was so upsetting.
Yeah. And it shows how entrenched these kind of dynamics and behaviors are. So again, if you're approaching these things, be it race, be it feminism, as individual acts and as not like the dismantling of a system that allows these things to be perpetuated, that's when we start, that's when things start becoming more problematic. It's when it's this one guy versus this one girl, and not, wait a minute, there was a whole system of enabling here from passing this guy through, from not looking at the ethics violations to essentially putting her on trial instead of putting him on trial, forcing her to testify, the type of fallout she's had to deal with, right? Because she had to say something about this man. And the types of people who are willing to defend that type of behavior because they feel as though, and again, this gets back to like the heart issues that we see so often, particularly in race and in feminism, right? The heart issue. If Kavanaugh is a problem, then maybe my son is a problem. And since I don't want to think my son is a problem, I'm going to say what he did wasn't that bad.
Right.
And it's that dismissive attitude, right? Like, I think in our pre-chat, we're talking a little bit, and I was talking about a piece that I had read that was about, friendships, like cross-racial friendships and white friends in particular. And, almost every person of color I know has that like heartbreak moment where you're talking to a white friend about, race or something important to you, and they basically just dismiss it. Like, this is not a thing that's important to me, or it's not a thing I think about, or I don't really care what's happening on this thing. It doesn't factor into my life. And you're going, hey, this is my life. And I thought we were friends. I thought we could talk about this. And it's just a really disappointing and really painful thing to go through. And almost all my friends of color have this moment where it's like, and then I stopped being friends with this white friend because we couldn't ever actually have a real conversation about what this is, because they were so invested in denying my own experience or my own words because they were trying to protect something else. And you see that again with like Kavanaugh hearings and feminism, right? This was so disappointing for so many women to watch and to see. And again, HBO re-aired confirmation like during the hearings. Like this, I don't know how much of more of an underscore and statement we could make about this. And yet the same thing played out. And there were female senators who just felt like I feel like he's still a good guy and we don't need to talk about this too much more. Because again, normally when you find, I don't want to interrogate this too deeply because it'll start to implicate somebody that I know or somebody I love. So I'd rather just not talk about it. I'd rather ignore what's happening, ignore your pain, ignore what this means, ignore what we're institutionalizing in order to make myself feel more comfortable. And that kind of hits the heart of a lot of these tensions that you start to see in movements in particular. I would prefer the vision of the world that I have versus one in which more of us are safe and more of us are free, because this one is more painful. I don't want to confront that.
Isn't that fascinating, the human dynamic with regard to that?
Really comes down to that, honestly. Like, we like to intellectualize ourselves as these like grandiose. I mean, humans are some fascinating creatures.
Oh.
Yes. It's this group dynamic and it's real basic. A lot of times, I just don't feel like dealing with this right now. Thanks. Wait a minute. And it doesn't matter. Like I said, it doesn't matter what movement you can. There are blow-ups across any movement, right? Disability activism, like you see these same fractures, these same issues again and again. And a lot of times it comes down to these human motivations that then help prop up and institutionalize systems that are unequal and unfair, because if I examine this too deep, somebody I know is implicated or I'm implicated. Therefore, I prefer to pretend that this isn't happening.
So, Latoya, I have to ask you, and I still giggle about this. Let's talk about the detox. Can we talk a minute about the detox that you were so great about participating in? Listeners, so you may know that I'll host a free 7-day detox from time to time. And Latoya was so great to participate. And she even posted photos of what she was eating. And you did such a good job. And we can you tell us about your little boy and his reaction to the experience?
So that was an interesting one. So the vegan detox. I mean, I've been flirting with it on and off. One of my closest friends is vegan, and there's a whole interesting like Afro-vegan history that at some point I'll give you some of those books. There's some fascinating stuff with that. There's a lot of movements around this. But a lot of my friends have been vegan for a long time. I was like, there's nothing really stopping me from doing this, right? It's like, I think the thing that detox taught me is that meat is like a habit. You just keep eating it all the time. You don't think about it at all. And there's, animal welfare conversations and things that have happened. But I think for most people, even just kind of like thinking, okay, I need to cut the cord a little bit is tough. And so when I went on the detox, I had come back from like this trip in Peru where we were like eating these crazy like 10-course meals that were very delicious, super decadent. And I was just like feeling extremely gross. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, I'll do this vegan, no caffeine, no sugar, no whatever detox. Wow. I don't know why I decided to do all at the same time. And so I ended up compromising a little bit. So I compromised on weed. Because it was like I got sick a couple times and whatever, but I think I skipped caffeine, alcohol, and meat the whole way through, which I was very proud of. And wheat kind of snuck in a couple times, and I got a sugar, I think, one of the days. But other than that, I stuck pretty much to it. But my son is really interesting because he is a little guy, and he's essentially, until recently, a vegetarian. When I was pregnant, I couldn't even be around meat. Like I couldn't even smell it. I couldn't go to the grocery store because I would throw up so violently. And he will generally drink green smoothies, and like he had no problems eating vegetarian anything. Generally, everything was cheese. He didn't like meat until he was like 4. And so it was really interesting. I'm on this detox, and it's like literally 1 week of just no meat meals. And the first day, I think I did pasta, which was fine. And he was just kind of like, okay, weird, there's no meat sauce here. But by like the middle, he started like actively crusading and being angry. And then finally one day we were at the dinner table and I'm like, okay, well, mommy made chili, but there's like no meat in it. And he goes, mommy, no, I want to eat meat. I eat meat. You don't have to eat meat. I eat meat. And I was like, oh my God. Because the child, also when he says he eats meat, he means like chicken nuggets and pepperoni. He doesn't eat any other meat. He doesn't like any other meat. like, where is this coming from? But I think it was literally just like the deprivation of it, where he was just like, no, like all of my favorite things have been changed, and I do not agree with this. But that was the detox, and that was a lot of fun. I'm glad I did it. I don't know if I would do that restrictive again, but I did incorporate a lot more like meatless meals into my diet because of it. To cook a lot more tofu now. Cook a lot more like, I can be vegan for breakfast and lunch, and then maybe I'll eat meat for dinner, but like, different things like that.
Yeah, no, I loved it. It was so fun to have you participating with us. And then I giggled whenever I saw your post about your son. I was like, oh my God, there's like a revolution about chicken nuggets, It
was insane. I was like, this level of passion for meat, I have never even seen it. And like, again, he only eats the 2 things. Like he doesn't care about anything else. Everything else is still vegetarian. So I was like, okay, sure.
And, my last question for you, Latoya, and I feel like we could go on and on and on with this topic. So I'll probably have to have you again on the show if you're willing. Right. Is the name of the podcast, right? Tranquility du Jour. So I'm curious, how do you find tranquility in your day? You've got a dog, you've got a son, you've got a husband. You're, always writing. It seems like you're always out and about doing stuff, And so, like, what are your kind of anchors for tranquility?
Gosh, yeah. And then again, you do racial justice work, it'll burn you out. You do feminist work, it'll burn you out. You need a self-care practice. You need a tranquility practice in your life. I think, like I said, that's where I landed, I think, on your doorstep all those years ago. So one, I really started prioritizing taking care of myself physically. So the tranquility, like that moment to yourself in the morning. For a while, I was doing the morning pages, just like everybody who reads The Artist's Way. I've done less of that now. I still do some free writing, but I don't do like 3 morning pages anymore. But I do try to take a moment in the morning to like sit and reflect and like just chill, like before my day gets started, before it runs away from me. Figure things out. I don't like to read something in the morning. So right now it's like Tribe of Mentors by Tim Ferriss, but it's the book rotates, like whatever it is that day. I've got like the next one I think I want to read is some Hafiz, some poetry called The Gift. But something that starts my day feeling like either empowered or artistic. And those things really help. I've been on this quest. So I just actually quit my most recent producer job. That was again, like super high stress and fun and crazy. And now I'm kind of like, oh, how do I remember how to slow down? Can I savor more things in my life? Can I try things that I haven't done before? So I realized too, like almost like an artistic practice really helps me. So I took my first ever drawing class yesterday at the Lemon Collective in DC, which is a super dope space.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, the Lemon Collective are amazing. And so I took my first ever intro to drawing class. I am not talented in that way at all. My fingers do not do those things. But I, really felt like I just wanted to stretch myself in a different way and to use and engage a different part. Because when you're spending a lot of time, particularly when I was blogging actively, like day in, day out, you're responding to social media, responding to people, you're responding to commenters, dealing with white supremacists, you're dealing with all these crazy people, and you're just like, I can't take it. People are sending you news articles about like the worst of humanity. You really have to be able to step back and say, this is a practice. One of my favorite contemporary writers is Adrienne Marie, and she writes Emergent Strategy. And she also has a new book coming out about like the politics of pleasure. And that is going to be really, really interesting. But she has been like at the forefront of kind of making sure people are keeping themselves well in the midst of these movements, that you're taking time for yourself, that you're reflecting on what's happening to you and allowing these reflections to happen. And so like she is just, fantastic in terms of looking at your wellness and your personal care of yourself as like both a spiritual practice, but also a part of your movement politic, a part of your dynamic. Because again, like if we're trying to do all this stuff to change the world and you're neglecting yourself, what are you actually doing? So those are, Tranquility in Your Day is tough with a 5-year-old and a job and juggling and traveling. But if you can find those rituals that allow you to reconnect with yourself on a consistent basis, I think that, most of the other stuff works out.
Thank you so much, Latoya. It's always a joy to chat with you.
Same. Always great to talk to you, Kimberly.
Savvy sources. So in the show notes, you'll find a link to find Latoya over on her website, also on Twitter, writing, and speaking. We also mentioned in the podcast Racialicious. So the website is not up at this time. However, I do have a link to the Twitter account, which is quite active, and also a link to the podcast interview with the authors of Manifesta, the book that we discussed during the podcast interview. Now, those of you new to Tranquility du Jour, you'll find information on my latest book, Year of Tranquility, a lifestyle planner that came out in January and comes with 5 bonuses you can purchase through Amazon. There's a link in the show notes. Also, Eye Candy over on Instagram. You can follow along with us on Facebook at Tranquility du Jour. And also, if you're interested in TDJ Eat Plants, that's all about living a more plant-based lifestyle. And Latoya is actually a member there and has lots to contribute. So you'll hear from her from time to time, sharing a recipe and whatnot. And then also watching YouTube, I have a variety of videos available, ideally with hopes of helping everyone find a dose of a bit more tranquility in our everyday. There's also a link to my locally sewn eco-friendly fashion line Tranquility, a link to my 6 books, e-courses, and this podcast app on iPhone and Android. And as always, I want to say a big, big thank you to everyone for tuning in, to Latoya for being an amazing guest, and I wish you a delightful week ahead. Namaste.